All right, everyone, this is just a continuation of the rest of chapter 31. In the last part, I did cover the tissues. Just one thing I wanted to mention, because this wasn't in here yet. Uh, I mentioned about putting an actual picture of the blood up, or that it was in another lecture. Well, anyway, I put it here because for the lab practical quiz, or the lab quiz, I will, expect you to be able to identify that this is blood, right, which is a connective tissue, just to review, and also to know the components. So these are the red blood cells here, and so it's pointing out a few of them. This is pulled from something specific that's looking at these, sort of defect in the neutrophils. Just don't pay attention to that. So you should know red blood cells, right? These little fragments here are platelets, right? Those are involved in clotting. Red blood cells carry the oxygen around. And then white blood cells here. So these are just giving, there are different types of white blood cells, but you should be able to identify white blood cells much larger. They stain purple because of the stain that's used. But even if you saw other white blood cells, you would be able to identify them. Okay, so again, there are many red blood cells, fewer white blood cells, and then you can see some of the platelets as well. Okay, so you should be able to identify the components and also identify that this is blood, which is a connective tissue. Okay, so also a reminder that you should be taking notes on your review sheet, right? For the next exam, you remember the next exam is chapter 31, 32, and 34. You should be taking notes on your review sheet. There is an assignment that you're going to upload that completed review sheet as we did last time. Okay, so let me go back to the organs. Let me not do it that way. Okay, so the next part of this lecture, right, is again just overview, organs, organ systems, and then knowing the body cavities that they sit in. Okay, so for an organ, right, composed of two or more tissue types that work together to form, to basically do a particular function, right? I'm sure if I just give you a minute, you can think of a few organs to yourself, right? So think of a couple. So obviously a heart, organ, stomach, organ, lungs, organs, right? Kidney, liver, all organs. Okay. And then you then have organ systems. And so these are various organs that basically work together, cooperate with each other to carry out a general process, right? So if we're talking about the digestive system, um, right, what organs are part of that? Stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Okay. And so those organs that are part of that system are all involved in digesting food, but then also absorbing those nutrients from the food that was digested. All right, and so this table is really just an overview. And so again, we will talk about some of these specific systems in more detail in subsequent chapters, right? For now, we should know overview, right? So for instance, if I ask you which organ systems are involved in coordinating body's activities, nervous system, endocrine system, acquiring materials and energy, right? Skeletal, muscular, and digestive, okay? So maintaining body shape, skeletal, and muscular system. So we should know sort of overview here. If we kind of if I give you a life process, we should know what organ system or organ systems are involved. Okay, so take a look at that table and make sure you understand what's there. Okay. All right. So now we talk a little bit about where these organs sort of sit, or body cavities in which these organs sit in the body. Okay, so you have a dorsal cavity, which that cavity is towards the back, and I'll show you a picture in a second. So that contains the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal, okay? So the brain sits in the cranial cavity, as you might imagine, and then the spinal cord is in the vertebral canal. So that's towards the back, dorsal, right? Ventral cavity towards the front, and that's divided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, okay? So thoracic, heart and lungs, abdominal cavity, most other internal organs like the liver, the stomach, right? Pelvic cavity, urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. Okay, and so for the that lab quiz, I also may include a picture like this and ask you to identify the body cavity. Okay, so cranial, right? Cranial cavity contains the brain. You should know also what's contained in each one of these cavities. Vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. these two together are the dorsal cavity, right? Because it's towards the back. This is all ventral cavity, but then that ventral cavity is divided into these three separate cavities, right? Thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic. Okay, so we should know what organs sit in each one of these cavities, where they're located, right? We should know the difference between the dorsal and the ventral cavity, and then again, what cavities are part of each one. So dorsal cavity made up of cranial and vertebral, it's the brain and the spinal cord. That one's pretty easy, right? Ventral cavity, thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic, and understand what or know what organs are part of each one of those. Okay, so this is just showing you from, from a frontal view here. Okay, so the next part of this lecture talks about the skin, right? So, or the integumentary system. And so, one, sometimes you hear this as a sort of trivia question, right? What's the largest organ of your body? And sometimes you might think liver, right? But really, the largest organ is actually the skin, okay? It covers, it protects underlying body regions, it regulates body temperature, it contains sensory receptors, okay? If you talk about small aquatic animals or you talk about amphibians, right, it's actually involved in gas exchange with the environment. Manufacturers also involved in manufacturing or making precursors to vitamin D after UV exposure, right? So you need some, we don't want too much UV exposure, but we need some UV exposure to actually synthesize that vitamin D, okay? And so that's happening in the skin. Okay, so skin and its derivatives make up the integumentary system. So we'll talk a little bit about the other parts, right? So first, if you talk about the different regions of the skin, the outermost layer is called the epidermis, and that's made up of stratified squamous epithelium. So take a second, think about what that means, because we talked about the epithelial tissues and understanding how they're named or categorized, right? Stratified means more than one layer, right? Multiple layers. And squamous refers to the shape of the cells. Squamous are kind of squished or flattened. So the new cells actually get pushed outward, and as they do that, they become keratinized, and basically they're dead and they get sloughed off, right? And so these new cells are actually sort of produced at sort of lower levels. And then again, as more and more new cells are produced, it pushes those towards the surface. And then, like I said, they become keratinized. I'll show you a picture in a second. And within the epidermis, you also have melanocytes, which produce melanin, which is those are your pigment producing cells, okay? Again, I mentioned, we don't want too much, we need UV light, right, to make vitamin D, but obviously we don't want to be exposed to too much UV radiation because it can cause mutations in the DNA of skin cells and can lead to skin cancer. So epidermis is the outermost layer. Okay, the next layer, kind of deeper or deep to the epidermis, right, is called the dermis. Okay, so it's deeper and it's also thicker than the epidermis. And so the dermis is made up of fibrous connective tissue, right? It has elastic and collagen fibers, and within that there's receptors, right? So sensory receptors, nerve fibers, blood vessels. They're all in the dermal layer, okay? Then you have the subcutaneous layer. This is really not really part of the skin. Loose connective tissues, that's sort of located below the dermis. It's known as the hypodermis, but really the hypodermis isn't really part of the skin, but anyway, closely associated with it, right? Okay. Now, some accessory structures of the skin. Again, I'm sure we're all pretty much heard of all these things, right? We're familiar with them. And again, I'll show you a picture where we can kind of review all these components. So nails, right? Grow from the nail root, form a protective covering of that distal portion of the fingers and the toes. Obviously, we know that. Hair follicles actually beginning in the dermis, and then they continue through the epidermis. And within those hair follicles, there's actually oil glands, right? I mean, those are sebaceous glands. And they're called sebaceous glands because they secrete sebum, okay? And so those are the oil glands, lubricates the hair within that follicle, but as well, the skin as well, okay? Then also sweat glands, which are present in all those, in both regions of the skin. They begin in the dermis, and they can open either to a hair follicle or to the surface of the skin. Obviously, we know what happens with sweat glands. They produce sweat. and super important in maintaining body temperature. Okay. All right. So here's that picture here, right? So here's your epidermal layer, the epidermis. And again, these, you have new cells that are sort of, think of them as sort of being produced kind of over here, right? Towards sort of the lower area here. And then they sort of keep getting kind of pushed up towards the top. And as that's happening, they essentially die off. They become keratinized and then they're sloughed off. But they're constantly being renewed by the production of new cells underneath. Okay. So this is just basically showing you all these things that I sort of pointed out in the last two slides. And by the way, on the lab quiz, this, I will not include a diagram of this to be able to, maybe I will, actually. I guess I potentially could. So if I was going to include this, I would only expect you guys to know like epidermis and dermis. All of these components, I don't really expect you to identify. So I may not include it, but if I did, like I said, it would just be you would be asked to identify the main components of the skin, right? So epidermis, dermis, remember the subcutaneous layer or hypodermis is really not part of the skin, okay? All right, so anyway, you can point out kind of some of these. You can see the sensory receptors here, pointing out melanocytes, right? Showing you a sweat pore. Okay, so you can see all the components there that we've talked about before. All right, and so this is actually an electron micrograph. Oh, I guess it's, yeah, a micrograph of the skin that's super clear, right? And so it's kind of showing you a hair follicle here, but you can see these keratinized dead cells, right? And then these are the cells undergoing keratinization, and basically the new cells are constantly being renewed over here, and again they ultimately become dead and keratinized and get sloughed off. Okay, so epidermis, and this is actually showing you the dermis. All right, same thing here, kind of what I said about there was that thing about regeneration. There's also a kind of little insert in the chapter that talks a little more detail about the skin cancer, right? Gives you a little bit of just a little more detail about it, right? So it talks about UV rays and how much exposure we should really have. And so that's what these pictures are pulled from. So that's on page 593 of your book. And so again, if you're interested, you want to read a little bit more about it, you can. I'm sort of skipping these extra things right now. If we were in class, we may do this in class, okay? All right, so this is just showing you some different types of skin cancer, right? Basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and a melanoma, all right? And so again, if you have something that looks suspicious, you should go to your dermatologist to get it checked out. All right, the last part of this chapter is on homeostasis, okay? So it says the organ systems of the human body contribute to homeostasis, obviously. And so what is homeostasis? And again, I know this is probably something you talked about in high school, right? And probably actually in grammar school, because I'm pretty sure my daughter knows the term homeostasis. The ability of an organism to maintain a relatively constant internal environment, whether that be, body temperature, right? Whether that be hormone levels, what have you. And so it says animals vary to the degree in which they can regulate internal variables, right? So that's going to be different, when you're talking about a human versus, say, a reptile or something like that, okay? And we kind of talked about some of this when we were doing, our sort of survey through all the different groups of animals that exist. Okay. So if we focus on the human body and talk about the organ systems of the human body and how they contribute to homeostasis, okay? So these are some examples. There are many other examples as well. Okay, so for instance, the digestive system takes in and digests food, okay, provides nutrient molecules that replace used nutrients. So the digestive system is involved in maintaining homeostasis of nutrient levels, right? Okay, respiratory system adds oxygen to the blood and removes carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system is involved in maintaining appropriate oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the body. Obviously, super important. Liver and kidneys store excess glucose as glycogen, right? And that glycogen can be broken down when it's needed to replace glucose. And you have a hormone, insulin, that regulates glycogen storage. And so again, this is involved in maintaining blood, and so we're missing pancreas here too, but if you think about kind of maintaining blood glucose levels, again, super important, right? Kidneys, these are involved in, yeah, you know what? I guess that's probably a typo. So this really should be liver and pancreas. Pancreas is gonna produce insulin and glucagon, which are involved in maintenance of blood glucose levels. Okay. Again, these are just meant to sort of be examples. So kidneys, um, under hormonal control, right? They excrete wastes and salts that can affect the pH of the blood. So the kidneys are involved in maintaining appropriate amounts of water in the body, appropriate amounts of salts like ions like sodium and potassium, and also as a result of that, maintaining appropriate pH. Okay. And so again, these are just meant to be examples. So I think so just sort of keep in mind that pancreas should be here if we're talking about maintaining blood glucose levels. And not kidneys. Okay. So I mean I'll probably fix that and then re-upload that new version. All right. Okay. So for homeostasis, a little bit more, right? If we're going to kind of give examples, right? It says it's controlled by hormones, but it's ultimately controlled by the nervous system. Okay. If we talk about kind of two mechanisms that are involved in homeostasis, or sort of one, actually primary one, because actually if we're going to talk about positive feedback as well, that takes you basically sort of away from homeostasis, but for good reason. So for negative feedback, right, that's the primary mechanism that basically keeps a certain variable, say like body temperature, to its set value, okay? So there is some sensor that will detect a change in the environment, right? Send that information into the nervous system, essentially, right? I mean, this is all nervous system, right? Sensing it, sending it in to the brain, right? Essentially. And there is some sort of regulation that occurs, and that will then initiate an action to bring those conditions back to normal, okay? So again, if you look at a really simple sort of analogy of this, right, is to think about, a heating system, right, or cooling, a heating system, really. This is basically that, right? So it's showing your thermostat, right? So here's your homeostasis, right? It should be a certain temperature. If we think about body temperature, well, it's giving you 68 degrees Fahrenheit, okay, as your set point. If it gets to be too hot, right, there's going to be that being too hot is going to basically be sensed by this sensor because it's 70 degrees, not 68, sends that data to the thermostat, and basically this thermostat, right, so the thermometer essentially is the sensor here. This thermostat then directs that furnace to turn off. Why? Because it's producing too much heat, okay? And then you return to normal temperature. Opposite of that, if it's too cold, again, that stimulus is that it's too cold, right? That thermometer detects that, sends it to the thermostat, and says basically turn the furnace on. Okay, so that's the analogy with the heating system. If we talk about in our bodies, and we're talking about regulation of body temperature, because this is sort of the easiest thing to talk about to illustrate negative feedback. Here's your normal body temperature, right? 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, above normal. Okay, again, that's the stimulus. And there are sensory mechanisms as part of the nervous system, right, that detect that. That data then goes to the brain, okay, and that will direct some sort of response. And so the effect for being, body temperature being above normal, right, it says blood vessels will dilate and sweat glands will secrete sweat. And then once that sweat is on your skin, it condenses. It's basically sort of pulling heat away. And so that's a cooling mechanism. We all know that. We sweat when we get heated, when we're running around, and it serves as a cooling mechanism because of the condensation of that water on the skin. All right, so vice versa, talk about below normal. Again, there are sensory receptors that detect this, goes into a center or a certain region of the brain. We'll leave it at that. That will then direct a response. And so here it's blood vessels constrict, no sweat glands, right? We don't want to be producing sweat. There are other mechanisms that might be activated, like shivering, right? Or the formation of goosebumps, right? That's sort of contraction of the muscles that then can generate some more heat. Okay, so when we talk about homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis, negative feedback mechanisms are the main way that this occurs, right? The illustration we gave is with body temperature because it's sort of easiest to conceptualize, okay? But all those other things that we talked about on the other slide in terms of maintaining homeostasis are sort of regulated in this way, right? In that if something gets away from a set point, it's going to be detected, right? The brain is then going to introduce or initiate some sort of response to bring it back to its set point, okay? All right, so there is something called positive feedback. Now here, this is not going to bring things back to homeostasis or back to that set point, but it actually brings about a greater change in the same direction. And so some examples here, so childbirth, right? So again, positive feedback doesn't result in equilibrium, and it also does not occur as often as negative feedback. Negative feedback is happening all the time. Your body always has to maintain homeostasis. Positive feedback mechanisms are just occurring usually in specific instances, like say childbirth. Okay. Also, wound healing is another example as well. So here, right, it says due to uterine contractions, baby head presses on the cervix. So those contractions start. Once the baby's head presses on the cervix, that sends a signal to the brain to basically release a specific hormone called oxytocin. And that oxytocin then causes more contractions to occur. Okay, so once those oxytocin levels increase, then contractions increase, right? So you had some contractions happening that then sent a signal to the brain to release a hormone that causes more contractions to happen. So you're getting further away from that set point, which is essentially kind of no contractions, right? But in this case, the body wants to induce more contractions, obviously, so that you can get that baby out, okay? So again, this is positive feedback because it's increasing that sort of initial change, which is the contraction, now is getting greater, right? More and more occurring as a result of release of that particular hormone called oxytocin, right? And so if you've heard of, a woman getting induced, right, or going in to get induced, they give you oxytocin, they give you Pitocin, but it's essentially an analog of oxytocin, right, to promote contractions. All right, and so that's that last slide there. So again, just kind of quick review in terms of for the lab quiz. So obviously for the lecture exam, everything's sort of fair game. I'm not going to include sort of identifying things from figures on the lecture exam. That will be on your separate lab quiz. Okay, so just a quick review. If parts of the skin, we should know epidermis and dermis, and I'll leave it at that if I put a picture of the skin on there, okay? If we now go back here to body cavities, we should be able to identify these body cavities, okay? So again, dorsal cavity is cranial cavity and vertebral cavity, ventral cavity, thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic, okay? And know what organs are in each one of those. For the lab quiz, I very well may include this diagram and ask you to identify the different body cavities, okay? And then what else is on that lab quiz is the tissues, okay? And so if I just kind of go from the beginning, we started with epithelial tissue, okay? We should be able to identify all these different types of epithelial tissue from these pictures. We should also know where they're located in the body, all right? Remember how we categorize them, right? By whether there's one layer or more than one layer, and also by the shape of the cell. So I always say it's better to sort of look at the picture and try to figure that out, right? Look at the shape of the cells and say, oh, gee, these are flattened, so I know it's got to be squamous. And then I only see one layer, so it must be simple, rather than sort of memorizing saying that's simple squamous, that's simple cuboidal. Actually look at what the cells are shaped like and then look to see how many layers there are. And I think that's an easier way of being able to identify these from pictures, right? Or from the microscope if we're able to use our microscopes to look at it, okay? So different types of epithelial tissue are here where they're located. The next main group of tissues we talked about were connective tissues, okay? And so different type, and these are pretty diverse, this group, right? So different types of connective tissues, okay? Loose fibrous connective tissue, dense fibrous connective tissue, adipose tissue, or fat tissue. again, be able to identify. I told you to be sort of less concerned with identifying, specific things in each picture, but I did say that we should know, like, this is a cell, a fibroblast cell. These are fibers, just based on the shape, right? The thicker ones are collagen, the thinner ones are elastic, okay? Hyaline cartilage, right? Bone. These are all connective tissues, okay? Blood, connective tissue. Okay, remember I added this in for this lecture here. This is the type of picture I would use for you to identify. Know it's blood, know the components, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, for muscle tissue, right, 3 types, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Make sure you can identify each one of these from the picture. Know, what a nuclei is. I mean, that's true even from the epithelial tissues as well. And sometimes looking at the shape of the nuclei helps you identify what type of tissue you're looking at, okay? So remember, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are striated. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. Okay, cardiac muscle is there's branching, right? So though the cells are striated, they're definitely not as tightly packed as the skeletal muscle. They also have these intercalated discs, and you can see the nuclei are much more round, okay, because they're not, again, like I said, as compact. Smooth muscle, no striations. You're going to find that in organs, okay, blood vessel walls and walls of organs. Right, and then the last type of tissue we talked about was nervous tissue. And so remember, you need to be able to identify the different parts of the neuron and also just identify this as being nervous tissue in general, right? If I showed you a picture like that, you shouldn't tell me that this is muscle, right? Or connective tissue. It's nervous tissue. We should know the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon of the neuron. Okay, also know that, and so that's in terms of identifying. All right, so I think that that's it. I basically reviewed, again, what will be on that lab quiz in terms of identifying all of the pictures are in this lecture. All right, thanks. Bye. Again, remember that you're supposed to be completing your review sheet as you're going through this. Okay, remember homework questions as well.